Thank you so much. I want to start by saying this event was supposed to be in the morning and then it was rescheduled, and the JLF organizers told me that there were so many queries, so thank you all for being here, because we all are here to listen to Kiran, and this is her first event in India for the loneliness of Sunny and Sonia, so I think we should give JLF and Kiran a big applause for that. I think now it's sort of a well-known fact that you have spent 2 decades on this book. And everyone talks about that. The Inheritance of Loss came out in 2006. I want to ask you a little bit about what it means to live a life in the service of writing. Because you've often mentioned about how days when you don't write, those days are empty, and how you have a tingling when you need to write.
Thank you, all of you, for coming. Thank you, Nandini. It's really wonderful to be back at JLF after, I think, 15 years. So writing, it became so deeply discipline. I think writing Inheritance of Loss was what gave me the discipline. And I work every day. I think of it as a kind of spiritual discipline. Everything in my life is so that I can get up and work in the morning and work through the day for as many hours as I can work. And I think of it actually really rather like the characters in my book, in The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. There's several artists, writers and painters, and also actually a woman who lives on her own and thinks of her artistic task as being that of creating peace. She's just left a very difficult marriage. And so like all of these characters, I am every day transposing one molecule of real life. And I also think of really like an ant or a bee or an earthworm taking one little morsel of real life and transposing it into artistic life. And that's how I think of it. Not so much as, I don't really think of it as writing a book, actually. I think of it as daily work.
There's a description in the book that comes very early. I want to read it out because I think at some point you mentioned that your process of writing is a bit similar to this, and maybe you can elaborate on that. So just a short passage. It describes a house help in Allahabad and how she comes every morning to sweep. With her head and face covered with her sari, which was the color of dust, she swept the dust from the house to the veranda, then down each wide, shallow step out into the guava orchard, which in season produced the famous pink guavas of Allahabad, fanning the dust into the dust upon the dust to make the final pattern of dust scallops all the way to the outskirts of the compound. Can you tell me a little bit about why you think your writing process is like this?
It's interesting. I mean, we are talking again of somebody who's doing slow, patient work in a kind of monkish way, right? You think of sweeping also as a kind of spiritual discipline in that way, of working, of creating a life of work, of service towards something. For me, of course, it's my writing. But you know that passage that you read, I'm really glad you read it, Nandini, and we didn't talk about what we were going to speak of this before this session, which is interesting. I had no idea you were going to bring it up. But it's such a lovely thing that you did, because in a way it's the heart of the book. And it's an image that has stayed in my mind since I was a child, because it goes back to my grandparents' veranda in Allahabad. And I didn't know these grandparents that well. We would go and spend summers there, but they still were, seemed a bit at a distance from our daily life. And I didn't know my mother's parents at all. These were my father's parents, who were Gujaratis in Allahabad. But that veranda has remained extremely important to my creative life. Surprisingly, I think Inheritance of Loss starts on a veranda with an old judge. And this book also starts with grandparents emerging upon the veranda. And it fascinates me that after so long spent abroad and working in New York, I'm still returning to that landscape first.
You mentioned Inheritance of Loss, so I'm just going to segue from that. So that was a more obviously political novel in the sense there was insurgency, there was, of course you're still talking about the diaspora and all of that. This is a slightly less political novel in the sense I think it can be a romance, right? It is about these two characters, will they, won't they, that kind of hooks us through the book. There's, I think, an observation in Sunny and Sonia, where someone thinks that it's so easy to talk to someone about world events or the delayed monsoon, but it's so much tougher to talk about the smaller things, right? Like whether you saw an ant in the grass or whether your sari is the right color or not. But I think this book is wonderful because it has all these tiny observations, and it's these tiny observations that make a big book. So can we talk a little bit about how different the process of writing Inheritance of Loss was from this, and also how these tiny observations are what actually make us human?
Yeah, I think writing a book is putting together, thousands of such tiny observations and small observations and weaving them together, as well as thinking about a much larger sweep, and perhaps also thinking of a deeper undercurrent. So you're working on several different levels at the same time. But it's absolutely true. I think you have to get those details exactly right. And it is also, perhaps writing, it's easier to write a political book. Oddly enough, I think it's easier to write an angry political book and harder to go into those private spaces between two people and to enter those conversations, the most difficult and private ones, about love, about death, things like that. And yet I think that's why we read novels, for those conversations. We don't read them for politics. We want to know what two people say, and it deepens our own understanding. Reading books, watching films, art is, I think, what gives us a vocabulary in our own lives. We have an understanding of love because we've read certain books. They help us in our own lives. I think that's why we read. But it was very hard for me, actually. It was hard for me. It's a much more difficult subject, this one.
So I'm sure many in the audience have already read the book, but for those of you who haven't, we have the two main characters, Sunny and Sonia. Both are writers in their own way. Art and sort of the creative world plays a big role through the novel, because we also have an artist who's a bit of a wretch, to put it mildly, not a very nice character. And then we have all these fascinating women characters who are the parents of Sunny and Sonia, and their aunts, and then the fathers. And we have these difficult moments between parents and children, between lovers, also between friends. A moment that really stuck for me was a daughter who's all on her own looking after her father who has cancer, and how they both are finding this so difficult. The daughter doesn't want to be there, but she is. The father's, of course, not used to being ill and having someone looking after him. I'm just curious about how, when all these moments, which was probably the most challenging in a way for you to create, or what sort of pushed you most?
As I said, I think that these are the private moments. These are the most difficult moments, and these are why we read and write literature. And the book is constructed, on the surface with all of these familial relationships of a changing landscape. So I was trying to trace the history of going from the grandparents' generation to the parents' generation to the children's generation, and thinking about how modern life, how modernity affects us in the spiritual matters of love and loneliness, as they are seen, as we see them through what is new, what we consider old, what we consider tradition, what we consider modernity, what we consider Eastern, what we consider Western. So Sunny and Sonia, they find that their own love story, their romance, is not actually their own. It is influenced by all the stories around them. It's influenced by their parents' stories. It's influenced by their grandparents' stories. and the sense of displacement that they're feeling in their very cosmopolitan life, moving from one place to another, is in parallel to the older generation's sense of displacement that you can trace to all kinds of things. The experience of colonialism, for one thing, a changing India, drastic, enormous journeys taken by that generation, which I had not appreciated when I was a child, going to that veranda in Allahabad. They seemed like characters, my grandparents seemed like characters out of a kind of humorous provincial theater. My Dadaji and Ba sitting on that Allahabad veranda, where the first conversation, just as in my book, the first thing they did when they got out in the morning and at dawn went up on the veranda was to discuss all the meals for the rest of the day, which were extremely hilariously convoluted, complex discussions that maybe all of you have every morning as well. What are you going to eat through all the meals? But they had made an enormous journey, from a small town in Gujarat. My grandfather always told us he learned the English dictionary by heart, studied for the civil service exams, went to England, returned to India, and very much gave up an idea of, gave up their faith, gave up their community, in exchange for a much bigger idea of India, in exchange for a sort of ideal of kind of secular democracy. And so I was thinking of what an enormous journey they made. And then looking at that, it's no surprise that Sunny and Sonia would also leave India and make their own enormous journeys. But it was interesting for me to go and look at all the echoes back and forth and trace why something very old in these families have produced Sonia and Sunny, and how something very old between India and the rest of the world is still moving us along.
These enormous journeys, of course, entail a lot of courage, but often they also throw the characters into loneliness, right? And I think this book is not just about loneliness in a personal sense. It's also about, a vanishing world, disappearing, what we know changing, just about the loneliness of borders and boundaries. Also, I think you mentioned very beautifully about how loneliness has a bit of a stigma attached to it. No one will kind of say, I'm lonely to a stranger, right? There is something shameful in a way, and that's how we perceive it. So can we just talk a little bit about that and about the many types of loneliness in this book?
It's really interesting. Now that this book is called The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, and it's out in the world, I can't tell you how many readers come up to me in the book signing lines and say, I'm so lonely. But I realized that when I was decided to write this long unresolved romance between Sonia and Sunny, and they're cosmopolitan Indians, they're Indians who are out in the big world, going back and forth between India and the Western world. Not just the Western world, they go between India, the United States, Europe, and very unexpectedly to me, I was surprised that this entered, but also to Mexico. And once I set the story out in the big world, I understood that I could widen the scope of the idea of loneliness and think of it not purely in romantic terms and not just in emotional terms, but also in intellectual terms, and to think of it as, think of all the enormous divides in a world that is so power divided. The divides between nations, between classes, the kind of distrust between races, all as a kind of loneliness. And the fact that the past is vanishing so fast, the past of our grandparents and parents, that generation, also as a kind of loneliness, but vanishing of the natural world in the same way, a feeling of being bereft. So all of these things, but also, as you just said, it's a matter of embarrassment to feel loneliness, and it's a matter of shame. But loneliness, I wanted to also show the lovely side of loneliness, because loneliness can also be sustenance. It can be the peace that comes after the war is over. And for Sonia's mother, it's definitely that. She tells her daughter there are many worse things than loneliness. It can be the absence of fear. It can be the time we need during times of, reinvention, self-reinvention. It's sort of a necessary loneliness. And I also think that in this world, like so adamantly demanding, such a rise in nationalism, and we're all fighting over national identities and religious identities and fiercely fighting over borders, I think we have to remember that we actually seek a more fluid sense of identity, which requires a kind of loneliness. We seek to escape that strong sense of identity, which does seem nonsensical anyway to people who are like many of us, living lives of shifting locations.
You mentioned something just in passing about how it surprised you that this book went to Mexico. When you say surprised, sometimes do you feel that the characters are driving you rather than you creating them?
Yes, I wanted to. That was the unexpected thing in my own life journey. Leaving India, going to the United States, and thinking of India, US, India, the way the previous generation thought of India, Britain, India. And then I think seeking a third way of thinking and living, and the unexpected thing of being in the United States, where I live in New York, in a very immigrant neighborhood full of Spanish-speaking people, full of Hispanic people, was the door opening to Mexico, and how important it was for me to go there and to see the United States reflected in the mirror of Mexico. And I feel like you don't know the United States until you go to Latin America and see what the US foreign policy has done there, and to see it from that point of view, the way perhaps you don't understand Britain perhaps until you come to India. It's a sort of a necessary journey. But also the other way, what was fascinating to me was to think of the way Mexico holds a mirror to India, or India to Mexico, and how wonderful it is not to have to go through a former colonial power or any imperial power to go between nations, and to think of India, Mexico in direct conversation. So that was a lovely thing for me. And many of you perhaps know of the Mexican poet Octavio Paz, who wrote In Light of India, which was a kind of lovely book of his attempt to make connections between these two countries. It was kind of nice to try and do the same, to be an Indian writer trying to do the same thing.
In some ways, does Mexico also connect you to your mother, the famous writer Anita Desai? Because she's, of course, written about it very well, and even in her most recent book. So sometimes is it in a way to kind of reach out to a similar piece of, a metal for the book? Just a similar context, a similar content that you have with your mother.
Yeah, so it's so lovely for me now that I look upon her life. She's 88, she'll be 89 this year. So she's had a whole long arc of career. So she started writing when she was in her 20s. I think she published her first book in her early 20s. And I see that, we share a landscape because we share family history. And that veranda in Allahabad, she has used it too in Fasting Feasting. It's the same place. And we would often go to Mexico and spend winters there and write there for several months. And I can see, again, the parallels. And she has used, there's, for example, the same scorpion we both saw with all of its 14 babies on its back is in her book and in my book. So I can see sort of lovely parallels like that. But her latest book was called Rosarita, which was also set in Mexico. Yeah. I was just thinking about, the themes of Rosarita entered my mind. And I think my book is so long. I wrote some 5,000 pages, and it's now whittled down to 700 pages, and it took me 20 years. But my mother's Rosarita it's a novella, and it's so short and so distilled, and in a way I feel like she did everything I did. It took me 700 pages, and she distilled it. And she said to me, she said, Kiran, you realize you don't need to don't need to take all of those pages, in fact. You do it much more swiftly.
Since you mentioned Rosarita, again, art is very central to that, and art is central to this, your novel
Yes.
as well. And we have this artist who is, mercurial, he's abusive, he steals a marble from a child, he's awful to his lover, but he's also brilliant. And he creates art and he gets great reviews. And it's often said that, brilliant people, because they have fame, this is what fame does to them. But do you think it's just fame, or is it something else? Can we talk a little bit about creating this character who's definitely not a likable character, and he totally has Sonia under his control, and Sonia has to break free from that to find herself?
So all the characters in the book come up against some kind of unknowingness. There's some sort of existential terror, some sort of void. And with Sunny, for example, he's a journalist and sort of creates a kind of unknowable creature out of himself when he moves to the United States. And Sonia, in fact, is displaced completely by this mercurial character, this artist. And the artist himself is sort of displaced by fame. That of fame has sort of claimed his mind and his existence. And he says at one point that when you lose, when you're no longer rooted in one place, in one community, where everybody knows you, when the world has changed and societies are changing and people are mingling so much, and you're no longer known for generations, and you no longer place your sense of self in, say, religion, which is a story that goes back into the past and will continue into the future, and you don't feel any sense of belonging, and your and not in family either, if the family structure is unraveled, then you are unknown unless you're famous. But if you're famous, you have to conjure an audience who loves you. And so that is his endeavor, and he is a powerful character, and the way the book is secretly structured is who is captured by whose gaze when it comes to all the power divides I spoke about, and all these different lonelinesses and rifts between nations and races and genders. And when it comes to art, when it comes to love, when it comes to journalism, Sunny being a journalist, when it comes to art, Sonia and Ilan. So she, in a way, her enormous obstacle is the fact that she's claimed by his gaze, which is something that continues to happen to young artists, and especially young women and older male artists. And so that interested me, that why it's such a redundant story, and it keeps on happening, and Sonia doesn't want to write about it because it's a story that's been told over and over, and yet she's been given a story she doesn't want. So she has to find a way out of that predicament.
It's interesting you mentioned gaze and how the novel kind of works around that. And just out of curiosity, I did a quick search and I found that the word gaze comes 25 times in your book. And I guess because there are these various gazes, right? Whether it is mother and son, whether it is lovers, whether it is on yourself. And there's this line which I kind of just made note of, which is what the artist tells Sonia. And he says, "What if I paint your picture and the picture becomes your fate," right? And I think that's kind of interesting. So can we talk a little bit more about that, and about, like you said, there's also, I think, the gaze of Babita on her son, and how at one point he says, "I feel my mother's gaze has lifted," and he suddenly is actually uneasy about that.
Yes, he feels trapped by her gaze even on the other side of the world, and feels her eyes are constantly on him, and she's sort of claimed her son, controls her son. Yes, these are characters that are all, trying to break free of that being in someone else's purview. And also thinking of the way countries are also, nations are also claimed by other nations in the same way. They're also somehow in the purview of other nations. This was also sort of interest to me. Oh, I'm going back. What exactly did you ask me? My mind is wandering all over the place.
No, it was just this, in sort of the context of gaze, the quote, "What if I paint your picture
Yes.
and the picture becomes your fate?"
Yes. So, I'm thinking of it also in terms of journalism. Look what's happening now, right? Who controls the story? Who gets to tell the story is what I was thinking. And when it comes to Ilan, this artist painting a portrait of Sonia, it does intrigue me to think of what you do when there's a version of yourself out there. Do you begin to change yourself to fit that version? Does it change your personality? Does it somehow foretell your fate? These are things that Sonia is thinking about because she's a young writer. This is an older painter, and she is a novelist trying to think of how she was going to construct a novel. She herself feels claimed and controlled by certain ideas of writing.
When you won the Booker, you were the youngest woman to win it. And over the years, you've just, with this book as well, you've established yourself as an acclaimed and a great writer. What is your own relationship with fame?
Well, maybe that's why it took me 20 years, is that I was completely a private individual. And what I think about fame is that it's, when you lose those eyes on you is when you can work, right? There's an enormous desire to not have eyes on you so you can work. But as we all know, there are artists who only want eyes on them. Their entire life is hoping that there will be eyes on them. But I just mentioned Sonia and her struggle to write. So I wanted to say in terms of young writers and of people working, it's such a big question to me how to write about India out in the big world, what ideas there are about India out in the world, talk about, and how to write about non-Western countries too, where the publishing world is so huge in the West. That's also kind of fascinating to me.
I want to leave enough time for questions, because I'm sure there will be many. Do we have a mic going around? I can see a gentleman with spectacles at the back. Sorry, I saw that other hand first, then yours.
Yeah, thank you, Kiran, for the book you've written. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. I'm glad it is 700 pages and not shorter. So thank you. But the question I have is, I read in an interview somewhere, and I think the interviewer brought it up as well today, you had about 5,000 pages of notes that you compressed to the 700. So I'm wondering how what criteria you used to compress. And second, now that the book is out, did it lean more towards love or more towards loneliness?
Now that the book is out, does it lean more towards love or more towards loneliness? I'm not sure. Maybe, I hope it's balanced I hope it's balanced equally. I hope it's balanced equally. But it was, that perhaps was also the organizing principle when I was deciding what to cut and what not to cut. When I came up with the title, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, that was kind of the lodestar that sort of gave me a way to think about the novel. And it was wandering all over the place. I followed the ideas because if you have an idea of loneliness, and if you have an idea of being controlled by the gaze and who gets to tell the story, you can go on forever, like the ayah in Allahabad sweeping the dust. You can go further and further and further and further with those, with this sweeping pattern. You can go on towards, out into the bigger and bigger world, more and more characters. And so I had to really cut out large portions that I miss, and I hope that I can use them in future work. I was talking about these grandparents who were so important to me, but my mother's parents, who I know very little about, my mother's mother came from Germany. Her father was from what is now Dhaka, of what is now Bangladesh. And that story interests me so much too. When it comes, and I'm thinking of nationalism, I'm thinking of Germany in the 1920s, thinking of time of Indian independence, thinking of what's happening now in the bigger world, in India. So I'm hoping to go to that next.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful session, actually. I'm curious about two things. One is you're from New York. You wrote this story in the context of American lifestyle, or a mix of Indian America, or so. What kind of culture you covered in your story, especially this one? And my second question is very simple. Did you use any AI, or what do you think about using AI in writing these kind of stories?
So I put into ChatGPT once, I said, write a story in the style of Kiran Desai, and it came up with Dance of the Seven Veils. And then it started under a mango tree.
And then went to a guava orchard.
Then went to a guava orchard. And I felt a bit embarrassed because I was watching, I'm often in the audience exactly where you are, and I was watching Salman Rushdie speak to the Jamaican writer Marlon James, who's been at Jaipur maybe once, maybe twice. And I think they got to the question of what advice would you give a writer, and Salman Rushdie told Marlon James, fruit in titles, just don't do it. And I don't think I would do it now. I mean, talking of Sonia deciding on how to write a book, I would not do it now.
But you also make fun of hullabaloo in this book.
I do. Now, as an older writer, you can make fun of the books you wrote before. I would never write that way again. I was very young, but I wasn't thinking about how to write about India and the bigger world at all.
But AI doesn't know that as yet.
AI doesn't know that. So, so that's the AI answer. And when it comes to writing about India, US, this book is very much set in a very westernized, among very westernized Indians, almost figures of fun. Kind of the very much the landscape I grew up in, but that is now really on its way out. That group of people who sort of occupied the homes of the British when the British left, and went to sort of occupied that kind of club life. So they're very westernized Indians out in the big world, and so in that way I didn't stray far from what I know. It's actually a book very close to what I know very well in terms of the people, the characters. I wasn't nervous about writing this book. With Inheritance of Loss, there were different characters who come from very different places than myself. But here, I knew these people, but I also, I've now lived in the States a very long time, and I knew that this was perhaps my last chance to really write a deep book about India, because I was still coming back during the process of writing this book. My father was still alive. I was keeping notes. I was going home, and I knew that I would lose the ability to write about India, and so I wanted to write one last book in this way, with this depth.
Thank you. There's a hand here, and I think let's take some from the back as well.
Kiran, lovely book.
Thank
I've
you.
started reading it. It'll take some time. But meanwhile, I've read your short story in the New Yorker. It is based on the book, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about why you did it? Because the short story is enchanting. It's very, very well written.
Thank you. It's an excerpt from the book. It's actually directly taken from the novel. So it isn't. It's secretly not a short story. It's an excerpt from the book. lifted from the pages, a little bit jigsawing together. But it covers Sunny's story and his relationship with an American woman before he meets Sonia.
Thank you. I think there's hands at
Please.
the back. I think there's a lady in the white t-shirt and then the black behind her, or red behind.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about the insects throughout the book. We were discussing the book together, and none of us had noticed the insects. And then one person did.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Can you?
Sorry. I wanted to ask you about the insects in the book. If it's there on purpose, if it's just a description and it happens like the cockroaches, the moths, is it there as descriptive but happens to be a metaphor for where the characters are? And the second thing is, are there other symbols you've hidden that give different layers to different people to how to read it? Is that a technique you've used on purpose to people to receive the book differently?
I think sometimes, you're just working, when you're working in a huge canvas, you are trying to orchestrate, trying to bring it together, and you're using the same techniques that perhaps a musician does. So you're working with echoes and repetitive images just to try and hold the book together in a different way. It's held together in several different ways, sometimes just by motif, symbols, but also sort of a deeper undercurrent. And I was interested in it. As you can see, there's a lot of jewels in the book, and those exist in two different planes. One just a simple greed for jewelry that Indian women have, but also a deeper idea of what jewels mean in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. So I was thinking in that way as well. I was thinking of the ideas of the sort of these spaces between people, places, nations, races, but then what populates those spaces in between. So there are a lot of phantoms, suspicions, nightmares. So quite often the book steps out of reality into those spaces. So I was thinking of that as well as a kind of connective tissue to the book. And the idea of the ocean and the clouds. There again, they're repetitive images and symbols and motifs. I'm still trying to unsettle the reality of the book in a way, because when you have such competing ideas of what is of reality in different parts of the world, what is real to one person is not real to another. A news story changes form when it moves from one country to another. It's read differently in different places. So how do you unsettle the reality of a novel, and move it out of a realistic novel in realistic time? That was also something that interested me a great deal. So yeah, those, for example. I could go on.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Also, how do you render the novel homeless? If a novel is so set, a novel loves a landscape and so rooted to place. And yet if you're talking about moving people, how do you get the novel to move? How do you make render the novel homeless in a way, put it out onto the street? Again, thinking of how to manage to do that while still making sense of the story and of the simple romance of Sonia and Sunny.
Hi, Kiran. I loved your book. In the book, I read about these dark, perhaps a lot of racist things that we think of the other race, other people from other nationalities that we think, but we seldom say or speak to one another, but every one of us has those thoughts. So did you encounter these things through your experiences? How did you manage to pen down the things that we perhaps talk about in secret, but never talk with other
That's so
people?
interesting to me. Thank you for the question. That as soon as you go to the United States, life becomes all about race. Race, 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 race. Every single thing, every single aspect of life in the United States comes down to that conversation, whatever you're talking about. Where, the universities, the courts, the homeless situation, life expectancy, every single thing comes down to that discussion. And as an immigrant, when you go to the United States, you're not aware of it at first, and then you gradually come to understand it, and yet it feels like a transgression to enter that conversation because it's not your history, you don't know anything about it, and on the other hand, it's now your country, so you had better enter the conversation. And also, as soon as you arrive, you're designated a person of color, which means you are part of the conversation, like it or not, which seems very strange. It's the strangest term. Can you imagine all of a sudden you're a person of color? It's such a funny way to think of oneself. And then the other thing that's fascinating to me when it comes to race is you're also meeting people from all over the world who've immigrated to the United States, and each one of these communities has a completely bizarre hierarchy of race in their own communities. Who is higher, what is the ladder exactly, who's a bit higher, who's a bit lower. Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, people from Thailand, Malaysia, Indians, Hispanics, each group of people. And in India, we have it too. Very carefully done. Who's here, who's there, it's all carefully put together. And we all know the unbelievably racist things Indians say and think. And these children have Sonia and Sunny. Sunny's mother comes from India and starts saying these things out loud, and Sunny has to shush her. I think that's a very typical conversation. So I wanted to write about that, both the ugliness of it, but also the humor and absurdity of it.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are
Thank you
totally out
all
of
very
time. Thank you so much, Kiran.
Thank you.
Please
To
go
lovely
buy her
audience.
book. She's available for signing, so please get her
Thanks.
copies signed. Thank you.